Habakkuk is one of the Old Testament prophetic writings and is part of the Minor Prophets. The Minor Prophets are the 12 Old Testament prophetic writings that come at the end of the Old Testament and are relatively short in length. We'll be drawing from Habakkuk in this media lesson to illustrate some aspects of exegetical methodology. We'll take a look at questions of historical and literary contexts, as well as some genre-specific issues like poetic parallelism and the use of prophetic oracles. First, let's ask the question of historical context. We could easily go to a Bible dictionary or a commentary on Habakkuk and read about the historical setting of Habakkuk as reconstructed by scholars, and this is good work to do. But before we do that, we can read the book of Habakkuk itself to look for clues to answer the question, when in Israel's history is this book written and to whom is it written? As we look at the early verses of the book, we do have the setting suggested to us. Look at chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife, and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. Notice that the situation described is one where violence and injustice reign. We see a very particular reference in verse 4 that helps to reconstruct the context. The situation of violence and injustice is connected to the idea that the law is paralyzed. It is here that it becomes apparent that the injustice described is within the people of God themselves. The law is Israel's covenant document, an instruction received from their God. So the situation seems to be one of grave injustice among the people of Israel. Another historical referent is described in verses 5 and following. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. In God's reply to Habakkuk's complaint of injustice, there's a reference to the coming destruction at the hands of the Babylonians. This reference helps us place the book of Habakkuk sometime between the time of Judah's conquest by Babylon in 586 BC, but after the emergence of Babylon as a world power in 612 BC. This also points to the southern kingdom of Judah as the likely audience of the book. With a sense of the placement of Habakkuk in Israel's history, we can move to issues of literary context. To get a sense of the whole book, of a book like Habakkuk, it helps to read through all of it in one sitting, asking the question, how does the book flow from beginning to end? In other words, what is the movement of the book? Reading through Habakkuk, it becomes clear in the initial chapter that the movement of the book is based on a sort of conversation back and forth between the prophet and Yahweh, or the Lord. The first 4 verses of the first chapter give voice to the prophet's lament about the state of things in Judah. Habakkuk says, "How long, O Lord?" The Lord's reply comes in verses 5 through 11. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe. The I here is the Lord. This is made clear in the following verses. Then in verse 12, Habakkuk responds to what Yahweh has said. Lord, are you not from everlasting? This counter-reply of Habakkuk runs all the way into chapter 2, verse 1. The Lord's reply back begins in 2 verse 2 and runs through the rest of that chapter. So it helps us to get a handle on the first two chapters by outlining them and then providing a title for each section. So far, we've identified the following outline. Verses 1 through 4, Habakkuk's complaint. Verses 5 through 11, Yahweh's reply. Verses 12 through chapter 2, verse 1, Habakkuk's response. And then chapter 2, 2 through 20, Yahweh's second reply. But it would help us understand the flow of these chapters better if we'd read through them again and use some content-specific titles for these sections. So here's my attempt at doing this after another reading. That first section in chapter 1, Habakkuk's complaint. Injustice reigns in Judah. The next section of chapter 1, Yahweh's reply. The Babylonians will be used to punish Judah. The section that spans chapter 1 into chapter 2, Habakkuk's counterpoint. A nation more evil to judge us? And then finally, the last part of chapter 2, in pretty much the whole chapter, Yahweh's response. Babylon will not escape judgment. The last title really comes from an analysis of a number of oracles of woe or judgment that run from chapter 2, verse 6 to verse 20. Verses 18 through 19, the final woe is pointed at idolaters, very likely the Babylonians in context. After getting a sense of the historical and literary contexts of a book, you can move to some genre-specific work in the book. Since Habakkuk is a prophetic writing, the book will include Hebrew poetic features such as parallelism, imagery, and sound devices like alliteration. Let's take a look at some examples of parallelism in Habakkuk. In chapter 2, verses 4 through 5, and these are very familiar ones from Habakkuk for New Testament readers, we read the following words from the mouth of Yahweh. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. Verse 4 provides an example of antithetical parallelism. The first two lines contrast the third. See, the enemy is puffed up, his desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Notice the contrast between lines A and B and line C. This is antithetical parallelism. Verse 5 includes a couple examples of synonymous parallelism, lines that communicate similar ideas that build upon one another. 5, C, and D are synonymous, as well as 5, E, and F being synonymous with one another. Because he is greedy as the grave and like death is never satisfied, we hear the commonality between those two lines. And then 5E and F, he gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. In addition to poetic features, prophetic writings regularly build upon prophetic speeches called oracles. We see examples of this in Habakkuk 2, verses 6 through 20. These verses consist of 5 woe oracles, or oracles of judgment. Each one pronounces woe upon a particular kind of person and includes the specific judgment and reason for that judgment. The 5 sections are in verses 6 through 8, 9 through 11, 12 through 14, 15 through 17, 18 through 19, and then a final word in verse 20. For example, Verses 6 through 8 pronounce woe on, quote, him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. The reason that can be expected, the judgment that can be expected is expressed in verse 7. Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you have plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. These words of judgment are followed by a reason for the judgment. The end of verse 8. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. By paying attention to historical and literary contexts and some of the particular genre-specific features of a biblical book, you'll be on your way to understanding the whole and the particulars of that book. In this media lesson, we've had the opportunity to do some basic exegetical work on the book of Habakkuk.